My name is Dr. Alexander Bianchi. I was the regional manager for the European, African, and Middle Eastern occupational hygiene operations for ExxonMobil Corporation. And effectively, I was responsible for running occupational hygiene programs quite literally from the north of Finland to South Africa, within the region. And, through doing that, liaising with my American colleagues, my American opposite number and my Asian Pacific opposite number. And between the three of us and our global manager, we essentially managed all of the company's operations and many of their joint venture operations on a global scale. So we were genuinely a truly multinational, global occupational hygiene organization, managing everything from aviation, refining, chemical manufacture, lube oil blending, buildings, building health, every potential aspect that could be defined as health related was within our purview. So it was a truly global organization, bringing together a team altogether comprising a rather impressive 95 occupational hygienists on a global level, which is probably, I still think that we were probably the biggest occupational hygiene corporate department globally then, and probably still now. And we ran an enormous number of programs and therefore, became sort of very, very significantly interacted with a number of sort of key global organizations, trade industry and bodies across the United States, the United Kingdom, Northwest Europe. We were very, very heavily involved with the REACH regulations and their dissemination into non-European markets in terms of compliance and, developing implementation strategies. In terms of myself, one of my own backgrounds was community health projects, and I spent quite a bit of time working in environments where essentially your role is not to continue an occupational hygiene program or program development, but essentially to build up from the ground an occupational hygiene program in a remote location. And that's quite a challenge, with the given resources and supply chains in some of the remoter parts of Africa, for example. So yes, it was a very sort of significant role. And I retired in my early 60s a few years ago from that role, and I was at the time of retiring occupying a post as an honorary lecturer in occupational hygiene with the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Manchester, and also helping a number of companies with their occupational hygiene training programs. And of course, I was, as a past president of BOHS, I was also involved in various BOHS programs. So that sort of kept me sort of busy over the recent years. And for my sins, I've sort of written a number of articles, a series of articles for Exposure magazine, and for other publications, really to do with the raising occupational hygiene issues, and essentially sort of developing discussion points, for the profession as a whole. And I suppose more recently, I was a member of the team that the presidential trio and our new CEO, Kevin, established at the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak. So I was fulfilling a role as a convener and coordinator in that regard. Something which we thought would last a certain amount of time, but certainly gone on a lot longer than we perhaps hoped for. But certainly, you know, it's pretty clear now that BOHS have made a pretty substantial contribution to that. But yes, you know, in terms of a sort of general painting a broad panoramic picture of the background, that's pretty much where I've been. I've probably travelled to most countries several times over, you know, within my previous role. So I've become very much involved with international affairs, you know, looking at global issues and looking at regional problems within a global framework. And it is probably true to say that you know, I hear people say from time to time that occupational hygiene has almost achieved, you know, most of what it set out to achieve, but it's pretty clear on a global level we're still at the beginning. You know, there's still a huge amount of work to do, and you know, I'm one of those people who believes that as the developing world continues to develop, and it will develop, you know, in the years ahead, that their occupational hygiene issues will rise, you know, and they will need occupational hygiene expertise at levels which will be unprecedented, in my belief. So I think that there's still a great deal of work to do out there. Well, it meant a great deal to me, actually. I've worked with Trevor Ogden in the past, and you know, Trevor, you know, for a very long time, he's been an exceptionally highly regarded person. You know, he's probably one of the regarded as sort of one of the sort of contemporaneous fathers of occupational hygiene. You know, certainly within the UK, and he's been an extremely influential individual. You know, Trevor is one of those people who, you know, has been what I would call the complete scientist. You know, you know, he's probably the most knowledgeable and most analytic and most insightful, you know, scientist, if I can put it in those terms, that I've come across, you know, over the last sort of 25 years. And you know, Trevor's ability to look at complex issues relating to exposure in all of its facets, and to be able to, you know, read complex data and then develop conclusions from that data. You know, one of the qualities that made him probably one of the most accomplished editors of the Annals of Occupational Hygiene that we've had for many years, and somebody that I refer to quite constantly, you know, in my time within the presidential trio, and in my actual year as president, we actually had some very difficult issues come up within that we're facing BOHS. You know, I won't go into those in detail because they would take too long, but we were really challenged by major organizations and institutions outside of BOHS, you know, challenging, you know, some of the things we were doing and saying. And Trevor was sort of very, very influential in being able to help advise me and the presidential trio and the board as a whole in terms of how we should respond to some of those challenges. So strategically, some of that guidance was about the best you could possibly get. And when I say challenges, they were challenges with a little edge of danger about them for the society. You know, and you know, Trevor was always sort of absolutely spot on in terms of his advice and recommendations. And we did sort of call on Trevor as much more than just the editor. You know, we were sort of using him as a sort of a combination of you know, learned, wise person, you know, with experience going back many years, accomplished scientist with a very sort of very objective way of looking at things, and as the editor of the Annals of Occupational Hygiene. So, you know, he was sort of giving on all levels, as it were. So, you know, when that award was developed, you know, I think we all looked at each other and wondered, you know, why the Trevor Ogden Award hadn't been developed before, perhaps. But you know, and Trevor being with us last night, you know, meant quite a lot to me, because you know, for those of us who've been working in occupational hygiene for, you know, a rather long period of time, I actually personally came into hygiene initially part-time in 1979, you know, which is seems like a very long time ago. I mean, it's 41 years ago. And even at that time, you know, people like Trevor were already, you know, making a substantial contribution to the discipline. So yeah, you know, I think, you know, Trevor himself is the person that we all look up to and all respect. And yeah, so I was exceptionally pleased and very pleased to be able to sort of see Trevor and talk to him, because, you know, very often with these awards, you know, as you know from last night, you know, many of the people that our awards are named after, you know, date back to the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and most of them are long gone. You know, Trevor is a living icon. He's with us today, so that's quite rewarding. Yeah, yeah, very positive.
And I know you've touched on this, often happens that you've touched upon it in other answers, but could you give us kind of a brief kind of your history with BOHS and kind of how you've seen it develop as you've developed, and obviously you've had such a big part in it. Is there anything you can say kind of along those lines?
Absolutely. Yes. In fact, you know, I came into occupational hygiene initially, you know, coming from a background of being a chemist, a professional chemist. And, you know, chemistry is probably, certainly was, the single profession that from which many occupational hygienists were drawn back in those days. Because occupational hygiene was seen as a confluence of two great disciplines, the discipline of applied chemistry and medicine. And, you know, if you look back at the history of occupational hygiene, one thing's sort of very clear, that in order to understand what's going on in an occupational hygiene context, you need to understand the scientific principles, many of which are, you know, primarily drawn from chemistry, but also from the other disciplines, you know, from biology, physics, statistics, mathematics, and so on and so forth, all of which are utilized by chemists. But also the sort of medical and quasi-medical aspects, you know, to do with effects on the human body and the ways in which symptoms and you know, illnesses, conditions, both acute and chronic, manifest themselves. And you know, in right from the very beginning, you know, 1979, I was involved in looking at the exposures to very toxic petrochemical substances to certain groups of workers who were also working in high noise environments. You know, they were being co-exposed to high levels of intermittent noise and chemicals. And what we were really trying to do was to understand the, you know, the interactions and to understand the amount of exposure and how we could do something about it. And it was, you know, I was introduced into BOHS by a very famous name from years ago, gentleman called Jim Sanderson, who was the president of BOHS, you know, many years ago. And, you know, when I finally joined occupational hygiene full time in the mid 80s, one of the first things that I was told by my sponsors, by my peers, is that you really must join the BOHS, because it wasn't known as the BOHS then, but to start to access the publications, to go along to the conferences, to go to the the technical meetings and things like that, and that's the way you really progress, because you will have a chance to interact with some of the great minds and the day-to-day practitioners in occupational hygiene, and you will also be able to access some of the texts that even then, BOHS was producing very unique guides and textual material, which actually became the basis for a lot of the guidance subsequently used by the Health and Safety Executive and by the other standard setting bodies. And also, of course, a very important thing, which is to to be able to study formal courses run by BOHS and to start to become accredited. And the BOHS that was then, in its then form, was highly influential. I mean, today we often fail to, perhaps because we don't have full insight into what was happening then, but it was desperately influential, if I can put it that way. BOHS was able to influence thinking and to, through its mission of communicating, science, practices, methodologies, and what we used to call the blue book methods. It had an incredibly strong influence on the practitioners who were taking all of that back into their companies and into their organizations, and were actually using those to apply to everyday business, which was actually making a real change, a real difference in terms of managing exposure, identifying exposure, and being able to manage it effectively. I think another aspect that BOHS brought forwards was that the field of occupational hygiene isn't just one of a technical nature. It's not just about being good at identifying, assessing, measuring, and controlling all of those health hazards, some of which were very, very difficult at the time, but also, very importantly, to be able to develop advocacy positions, to be able to assess situations from a managerial point of view, and to be able to develop an advocacy case to bring to senior managements, to influence policy, to influence practices, to help develop new procedures which would deliver sustainable health improvements, not just health today, but forgotten about tomorrow when the lights are switched off and the focus on the program had sort of come to its natural end. But to make that sustainable, to make it part of the infrastructure of those organizations. So in that way, BOHS had tremendous reach, absolutely amazing levels of reach. And it provided a very powerful forum through which all of these people could come together and continue to develop standards, so much so that I remember back in the 80s that many bodies, trade and industry bodies, many authorities, many institutions came to BOHS, to get BOHS guidance and advice and recommendations. So my experience was that BOHS was punching far above its weight, as they say. It was already sort of having a very, very big influence. It also became very evident to me in the the late 80s and into the 90s that BOHS was attracting a lot of attention with its foreign contemporaries. There was a lot of very, very influential links with the American Industrial Hygiene Association, which is a huge and very, very powerful body, and also with the Australian and Canadian bodies, latterly with the Singaporean bodies. And what really happened was that BOHS became a home, not just for UK-based people, but people were coming from all over the world, to BOHS's door. Hygienists in parts of Africa were coming to the UK for their hygiene training, and that was really a big thing, at the time, that BOHS had the word British in its name, but it was not just British, it was actually international. It was a truly international organization with international reach. And I think that it took some time, but eventually I think, bodies like the HSC and other august bodies, really began to recognize BOHS for its potential. And, I think that has influenced a lot of direction that's been taken since. I still maintain that BOHS has got a long way to go. But what I find very, very positive is that many of the hygiene institutions and hygiene membership bodies overseas have told me over the last 15, 20 years that BOHS was the model that they followed. It set the standards, it set the protocols, it published the guidance. And, so I don't know if we've ever measured it in BOHS, but it's pretty obvious, from a purely subjective point of view, that BOHS's reach has been prolific over the years, absolutely prolific.
With the exception of winning this award, what would you say the biggest achievement of your occupational hygiene career has been?
I would basically say that and I have thought about this, but there's probably several that are worth mentioning. When I was working as I ended up as a site hygienist, and then I was asked to start supporting other industry, parts of our organisation, further afield within the United Kingdom, still at that time, and developing and building my own expertise. And one of the things that became very obvious was that I know it may sound a bit twee, really, was the amount of gratitude, if I can put it that way, that was preferred, to me in different places, for having, and I know it's a much used phrase, but having made a difference to people's everyday working lives in many different contexts. And, you tend to become very well known. You find that there are people all over the place who know you quite well, but you may not remember them or remember their names. But and it struck me that occupational hygiene done well can have an enormous amount of influence in different places. It really can make a difference to people's working conditions and their jobs, for which many people are actually extremely grateful, and that sort of gratitude, if I can put it that way, it's not just the workers, it's the management as well, because the HSC brought out an initiative a few years ago called Good Health is Good Business. And where hygiene can both deliver genuine, tangible health benefits, and it can also be good, save the company money, help them to invest more efficiently in controls, so that your work can actually help save money that can then be wound round into putting into permanent controls, so the whole thing becomes self-sustaining. That's enormously rewarding to a hygienist. It really proves that you make a difference, and that's exceptionally gratifying. I suppose moving on, I then began to operate more on the international circuit. First, by being a member of international common interest teams, working with teams to address problems, across Europe or across broader horizons. And I ended up working on a number of project groups based in France and Germany, you know, collectively addressing some very significant issues. And you know, I think one of the, in terms of sheer leverage, we were very heavily involved in looking at data and working with epidemiologists and toxicologists and statisticians to try and understand big data. And from some of that big data, and there are some really amazing examples I could give you, we were able to reach some really significant conclusions about exposure that actually resulted in significant changes to occupation exposure limits and significant changes in the selection of control technology used to control exposure. So the numbers of workers who were benefiting from that weren't in the tens or the hundreds, they were in the thousands. And that was an exceptionally rewarding activity. You know, believe me, you know, you really feel that hygiene is a powerful profession when you can see the way in which it can actually reach that far and make such a big difference across such an enormous horizon. I guess sort of later in my career, I was involved in two areas that I think for me really made a difference. One, I was the lead health investigator in probably one of the worst Legionnaire's disease outbreaks in recent times. And it was an outbreak that you know, when the incident first occurred, it was believed that the incident had happened and was now, you know, in its senescent phase. But when I got there, it was in France. It had only just begun, and the mortality rate was climbing, the case rate was climbing. You know, the whole thing was running out of control. But to cut a very long story short, you know, we did manage to address it. The consequences of it were that an entire business group was rendered functionless. Hundreds and hundreds of people lost their jobs. It redrew the map in terms of Legionella science. The case ran for 10 years. So something I was involved in that we thought was a small short thing actually ended up in French courts, and you know, and me being subpoenaed by the French government, and a whole range of very, very complex issues. I think one of the, you might say, well, how on earth can you look back on that with a sense of satisfaction? I think I did, though, because we were able to really make new inroads into discovering things that had never been known before, you know, by marshalling some of the best teams anywhere in the world that we could to bring together to look at this collectively. And, you know, we were able to help authorities all around the world look at their Legionella guidance, control guidance, and to update it and modify it in light of the this exercise. You know, it was more than an exercise, but that had a really big influence. You know, it's one of the single biggest projects I've worked in hygiene in my entire career, and although I was very sad that there was a very significant human cost, and that was tragic. But at the same time, the leap forward, you know, in terms of where we were and where we got to, was prolific. And as a hygienist, you know, as hygienists, we like to bring good news, but we're often in the position, as many of my colleagues know, of bringing seas of bad news. And it's the way in which we bring seas of bad news, but also be able to advise Caesar what to do next. You know, that's the real skill in hygiene, is to avoid, you know, being punished by Caesar. Is that we are able to actually, you know, make that difference and bring things forward. And I think that had an enormous global influence. And I like to think that as a consequence of some of the changes we made, we were able to prevent a whole series of preventable Legionella deaths in other countries. We'll never know the absolute number, but I believe that there are many people alive today that benefited from the new discoveries we made, the new science that we uncovered, and the way we were able to bring things forward. I feel, you know, quite satisfied about that, because you know, if you're a hygienist in a career sense, you know, you're very often looking to be able to look back on your career and say, did I really make a difference? You know, was I able to do anything? And you know, I think that particular episode was one of the big ones. You know, despite, as I say, the human cost. And then I think finally, I think one of the things that struck me was the way in which we were able to make a difference in some of the, and I was able to play a significant role in some of the most challenging parts of the world, you know, to bring hygiene programs into parts of West Africa, into the Middle East, you know, in places that are, even on the best of times, are incredibly difficult places to work, with an enormous number of health challenges, you know, with other health hazards omnipresent, such as malaria, waterborne illnesses that actually kill people, you know, all kinds of other, you know, enormous health challenges, as well as the exposure challenges. And to be able to go in there and to be able to develop new teams from the ground up that are able to actually develop and continue their own programs, that makes a big difference, you know. And over the years, you know, I've had the positive experience of talking to senior managers who've said to me, do you know, I didn't know much about occupational hygiene a few years ago, but he said, now I know about it, I asked myself, why did I not know about this discipline before? But not just that, this discipline has made a huge positive difference to my business, and for which I'll be very grateful. And you know, when senior and some very hard-bitten managers share that with you, you know, that is, let's just say you go home feeling better about, you know, what you've achieved than you might otherwise have expected. You know, and I think that is the power of hygiene, that you know, we are working within a profession that can work collaboratively with safety, with the environment, with you know, the classical sciences such as toxicology, epidemiology, virology. We're hearing a lot about those with the coronavirus issue at the moment, but that in many cases it's hygiene. It's the bringing together of all of those threads and turning them into a cohesive program that works. That is what really makes a difference. And that is one of the unique assets of occupational hygiene. It's one of those areas that I find that once you get the attention of the people that you need to communicate with, then, you know, then you've got it. You know, they will give it to you and they will want more. You know, this is something that is, it's so consistent, is that once people know what hygiene can do for them, they want more. They're hungry for more, because they realize the potency of it, the power of it, you know, what it can do for them. And I think it's to do with, I think, the universality of occupational hygiene, that it's unlike many other disciplines, it's one of those disciplines that basically reaches in many directions, you know, and attempts to contribute, you know, across a broad platform. And you know, I think it's through that kind of outreach that you really change minds as well as practices. You know, there's an old sort of vision that it goes back to the American management models, you know, that were developed probably in the 60s, that you have systems, you have processes, you have procedures, you have the sort of trophic level, within which key activities are defined. And one of the points that I've been involved in making as powerfully as I can over the last sort of 25 years is that hygiene occupies a space in every level of the sort of triangle. Every level of the hierarchy, occupational hygiene has got something to contribute at each level. And it's in the communication, it's in the vision, it's in the path forward. But if it's a good quality, well thought out program, then you can demonstrate to whether it's a corporate managing director, whether it's a section manager, department manager, the guy who runs the workshop, it makes no difference. That message properly made really hits home. I've come across that on so many levels. It's interesting. I was on a call before yourself today, and I was being told about people who hygienists who are actually employed by racing companies of all, and they travel with the racing teams, and they give them advice on managing fatigue, exposure to fumes, exposure to heat stress, ergonomics, who sort of delivering the whole package. And I must be honest, I did not know that such people existed. That they were actually employing occupational hygienists to do those kinds of things. And I thought, gosh, what an exciting job. I'd love to have been involved in that kind of occupation when I was younger. It just keeps amazing you, the number of occupations where occupational hygiene has found a niche. It's not just the old style, industrial, assembly line operations. It's many other areas. Yeah, it's quite exciting, really, when you think about it. They have this idea about actually being able to utilize occupational hygiene as a kind of support to the marketing department. And I thought, no, that's interesting. How does that work? And it was really terribly simple and terribly elegant, really. And so essentially, I'll give you an example. There's sort of companies like Rent-A-Kill and the sort of Acme paint company, and they're quite regularly changing their solvent blends that they put into their different products. And one of the biggest problems they have are problems related to exposure, smells, application use. Those are the real problems that they encounter. And some companies have had this wonderful idea of saying, if you buy our product, we'll actually provide you with an occupational hygienist who will help you not only in order to understand the the MSDS, the manufacturer safety data sheet, and the compliance and regulatory aspects of using our product, but will also provide assistance in managing all of those practical applications issues, and to support you with exposure assessment and identify what kind of controls would be needed. And those companies absolutely loved it. They said, it's a wonderful idea. And those companies who were selling those solvents actually saw that they were actually stealing a lead in the market, because they were actually providing hygiene as a packaged service to go with their product. And it was temporary, obviously. It was really just to help them get off the ground with use of that product. But it was almost like looking at the REACH regulations and what they were kind of leaning to, but ramping it up to the power of 10. And not only is it incredibly interesting for the hygienists themselves, but it's a very good way of introducing companies that don't have a strong history of hygiene, introducing them to hygiene, and actually helping them do their job better. Because we know from history that people who spray, whether it's paints or pest killing fluids, have always been at higher risk of exposure and develop higher levels of health problems over long periods of time than many other professions. So in many senses, it's a wonderful example of how hygiene can be applied in a way in which most people wouldn't think about, and which really makes, again, a huge difference, a real improvement.
I've just got one question left for you. So what do you think, it's quite a kind of open-end question, what do you think of the future of occupational hygiene in terms of what it will look like or how it's shaping to be? And obviously, I assume if I'd asked that maybe before Corona and now, it would be two different answers. But so from your professional point of view, how do you feel like it's going to progress from here?
Well, first and foremost, I think that occupational hygiene needs leaders as well as good technical hygienists. We need people who have different skill sets that they can bring to the front. If you're a very, very good and able and competent technical hygienist, you can make a huge difference in certain areas, and that's marvelous. But we also need some very, very motivated leaders with a very clear vision of occupational hygiene and what it can do and how it can deliver. I always used to say that you need a hygienist who can talk to the boardroom as well as to the workforce. And when I say talk to, I really mean communicate with, not from a distance, not in some remote way, but actually speak to them. And that's incredibly important, because to be a good hygienist, I believe you need to have some of maybe the qualities of, say, a good preacher, for example. You need to be able to reach out, and you need to be able to get people to understand the dimensionality of hygiene. It's not a cold, remote, one-dimensional science or discipline. It's multi-dimensional, and you have to be, I don't want to use the word passionate because it's so perhaps overused as a word, but you need to be committed and to believe in what you're doing, and to bring that message very strongly, and to not be afraid to bring it to people at the top. Speak to government, speak to leaders, speak to business leaders, speak to those people in influence and power, and whatever that may be defined as, and bring them on board, because there's such a wonderful message to bring in terms of hygiene that there's no reason to be embarrassed or reticent, or to feel that you're wasting their time. To go back, I've said it before, to the good health is good business. If that's the language in which they need to hear it, then it's not difficult for hygiene to be able to do that, because it all fits together. It's all part of a greater whole. And in fact, if you look at organizations and countries as a whole that don't have hygiene, or have never been able to develop hygiene, they're the poorer for it. They really are, and their workforces are the poorer for it. It's an interesting cultural share, but when I was in Saudi Arabia, I actually went to talk to many, the ordinary Saudi workers. And of course, I spoke no Saudi and they spoke no English, but I had two excellent translators. And I was able to talk to them, over days about hygiene and how we could bring hygiene to them. And I always remember there was this marvelous Egyptian doctor that was assigned to work with me. And he was really, he was conducting respiratory monitoring, in the desert, using very good equipment. I was incredibly impressed by the guy. And between us, you know, we were really able to make a difference. And years later, I was told by, you know, some of my Saudi contacts, he said, you know, those guys, they still remember that talk you gave them, you know, all those years ago, and how that influenced their way that, you know, which they saw the OH part of you know, medicine, occupational health and environment and safety. They actually saw the hygiene bit. It really meant something to them after that point, and it stayed with them for years. And you know, to the point where we even had hygiene contacts in those places, which we thought would be all but impossible, but we actually did that. So it's that being able to go to those places, you know, and to be able to bring the hygiene message to all of those places that need it, no matter how remote or difficult or hostile they may be. And that is what is going to bring hygiene, the profession, forward into the world as the world develops and expands. I think also for the future of hygiene, we need to be able to work internationally. I think that's incredibly important, and to be able to work cooperatively with other countries. You know, and I know we already do this. You know, we're tied into the IOHA and other August bodies. I personally would like to see us have more representation on the World Health Organization. I think that would be very useful if we could. I know that we have some influence in some other international standard setting bodies, which I think is very positive. But as BOHS, we must continue to strive to do that, to ensure that we get out there and we take part. You know, we're present around that table, wherever that metaphorical table may be. I think that is important. I think also another danger that we must be wary of is that during one of my presidential addresses a few years ago, well, back in 2011, more than a few years ago, I tried to warn of the danger of codification of hygiene. There was a body of thought some years ago that basically went off at not a tangent, but developed a kind of ideological sort of approach whereby there was a view that you could model a lot of occupational hygiene. You know, you could rely very heavily on models, and at the same time, you could codify hygiene. So you could simplify hygiene down into some very simple algorithm with, you know, inputs and predictable outputs. And at the time, I was sort of very wary of this, and you know, I think to an extent, you know, my anxieties were confirmed, because what we found is that many models that we placed a lot of faith in didn't always deliver the results that we hoped. And I think if you're talking about remote entities, you know, modeling may be useful, but when you're talking about actual human beings who are having real exposures and actually enduring real health effects, to model those, you know, to consider modeling as a suitable and sufficient response is perhaps, you know, something we need to be very careful about, you know, as a substitute for actual monitoring and actual measurement. So that's something we need to be aware of. And I think also codification of hygiene. I think codification works up to a point where the inputs and outputs are very simple and straightforward and highly predictable. But so much of hygiene is not predictable. And there's an old American Indian saying that we walk into the future backwards. And I think that's very true. You know, there's another very well-known story of the toxicologists and epidemiologists sat around a room and trying to have this sort of imaginary discussion as to which of them really can predict the future best in terms of how health effects will manifest themselves as a result of certain types of exposure, particularly complex multi-exposures. And what we've seen is that neither has the dominant position. For some types of health hazards, the toxicologists may have it. In other areas, it's the epidemiologists may have the leading edge. But we as hygienists, we have that wonderful and rather unique ability to bring the whole thing together and to see the bigger whole. And, you know, for me, I would say that although in some instances compartmentalization of health hazard exposure assessment awareness is useful, you still need people who can see the big picture to bring the whole thing together. And I think really that's where hygiene has a lot to offer and will continue to have a lot to offer in the years ahead. People have postulated, can hygiene get more into things like workplace stress? Can we get more into ergonomics? Can we get more into environment? You know, can we work more in that area? And yes, I would say that in the area of climate change and global warming, I firmly believe that climate change and global warming will change exposure scenarios, and that we as hygienists are the discipline best positioned to be able to study those, to examine those, and to be able to bring something useful to the table in terms of helping workforces to be able to adapt to those changes in a way which minimizes the risk to health. So yes, you know, there are areas that we can bring a lot of value to, and we almost certainly will be challenged to do so. And there's other areas where I think we need to be more thoughtful and maybe take a bit more time to consider whether that is something that we can genuinely add to. You know, to reflect for a moment, you know, I personally, you know, remember working with a lot of occupational physicians on workplace stress management courses and training and introducing programs, you know, to workers. And yes, hygienists can make a change, but can we play a significant role? I would say, I think only in concert with our clinical colleagues. I don't think we can necessarily do so alone, as it were, from that point of view, but as part of a team. So I'll summarize by saying, yes, there is a tremendous future for occupational hygiene. I think we have to continue to, you know, keep those tenets in mind. You know, we need to keep reminding ourselves that we need to be leaders as well as scientists, and you know, really to take those big steps forward and you know, introduce hygiene to the world and not stop doing it. I think that's incredibly important.